So I'm going to share my story, which is really, it's the first time I've really talked publicly about it. And as Myrna was saying at the beginning, you know, there are different phases of the kinds of experiences that you can have. And she said the most extreme is when you hear voices that tell you to harm yourself or other people. And that was my experience. So I wanted to share a bad part of the experience and a good part of the experience in as much time as I have today. So I will keep my eye on the clock. You know, so because of the nature of the kind of intensity that can happen, I hope people forgive me for having the attitude that I do, which bluntly is that I think that there's not enough focus on the kinds of dangers that they even talk about in the Sanskrit texts and the kinds of things that can happen. Now, why I went from being like this to being thrown into a very kind of hell environment and then came back again, and I'm not living on meds in my car like so many other people, I have no idea. But whatever happened, I think a lot of us are having really out of the box experiences, and I think it's really important to start talking about them. And so I'm kind of publicly disclosing aspects of my story that I don't often share with people in the hope that it offers some support or help to other people. But I think a lot of people are really focused on unleashing Kundalini. That's really kind of the focus and the effort. Or I'll be in yoga class and I'll hear, if you feel a little wave up your spine, that's okay, that's just Kundalini. And we all have Kundalini in our body. That's why we're here and we're animated. So I'm going to share with you also from a Chinese medical point of view, how it relates to the Indian perspective, and give you my definition of enlightenment within that. And I will also share with you the result of the experience, which has been really my obsession for the last 24 years now, this December, since that experience happened. And it really turned into my life's work and a real passion and obsession. But the reason that it's driven me so much to compile the theory that I have between Eastern and Western medical systems and learn as much as I could about these kinds of natural biological out of the box experiences that we're having is because it's really just been a healing journey for me. And I really needed to piece myself together after that experience. So I don't mean to freak anybody out. And I certainly know that there are a lot of blissful experiences. I did have a bliss experience at the end of a month. So I'm going to share something that's kind of trippy about that, but I just found some scientific information through Joe Dispenza that backed up what happened to me, so I feel a little bit less uncomfortable about sharing it. But really, this is kind of pivotal for me to this talk, because my work is literally coming out right now, after all of these years, as I'm being asked to talk about the actual experience that began it. So I want to start by sharing some ideas around why we stay silent, because I know that a lot of people listening probably are having or have had out-of-the-box experiences. Some people are comfortable with them, other people are not comfortable with them. Some might find my story a walk in the park, and other people might find it really strange. But I've spent a lot of time realizing why we stay silent. And so I want to just kind of walk through a few ideas with that, because, you know, really the first thing that happens is that, you know, when somebody tells me a story, my brain is going through a bunch of files on the bookshelf looking for the file that understands your story. And then as soon as I can find an experience that matches yours, I'll put it in and I'll stick it up on the shelf. And this is a really important thing that we do as a society, because the truth is we're spinning in space for absolutely no idea why, and we have no idea why we're alive, or how long we're going to be here for, or if it's going to hurt when we leave, or what happens afterwards. So with that pocket full of confidence, we walk out into the world. And it's very important that we all agree upon a particular reality. It makes us all feel safer. So I'm using those files to find a way to feel like I'm good with you in the world, you're good with me in the world, and things make sense. And if I can't find a file, I'll find one that's similar, that I think matches your experience that you're having. And beyond that, I might just think that you're a drama queen or king, or you're lying, or I might even just be offended that you think, in any reason, that you could possibly have an experience that I'm not familiar with. You know, I've had people say, like, I understand your words, Meredith, but meanwhile, I was trying to express something. Like, it's not okay for us to just have different experiences and share them, it seems. So it's not, you know, feeling that you're offending people or that you're considered crazy or all those different kinds of isolation is a lot of reasons why we just stay quiet. So my work for me was a way to deal with my isolation and deal with my fear over what had happened. And then my amazement at the awe, I was down on my knees, metaphorically and literally, you know, in the whole experience, and when the bliss experience happened. And the last thing that might happen is that somebody might say, like, that's just fantastic that you've had an experience that I know nothing about. Like, that's great. And people don't usually say that. It's kind of like a primal need for us to all agree with one another. So, or people will say to me, God, I wish I had that experience the odd time that I've shared it. And I will say that the bliss was remarkable. The whole thing changed my life. It redirected the course of my work and gave me my life's work, in which I'll share in a bit. And honestly, if the gods came down to me and said, we'll give you that bliss experience again, and you need to go through that month again, I would say no. I really would. So when people say to me, you know, oh, I really wish that could happen to me, it's like, I feel like they're not hearing the first part, and we focus a lot on the second part. So I think we isolate ourselves a lot, and I'm sharing my story today because I know that hearing other people sharing their stories would have really helped me at the time. So I'm kind of coming out of my own box to be able to share some things that I hope help. When I went through the difficulties with voices in my head and what happened, I got a lot of insight around, well, I will share what happened to me at the time and the insights that I had afterwards. My work today is about understanding neural frequencies in the body. So I'm going to jump to what has happened over the last 24 years since that experience. So as you mentioned, I was trained very extensively in shiatsu and Eastern diagnostics, and then I went on to study acupuncture. And it was between the end of shiatsu school and the beginning of acupuncture that this experience happened in my mid-20s. And what I see now when I look at the body, I'm just going to share my screen with you. When I look at a body, this is really what I see now. So I'm well trained in anatomy, and we focus on the physical, but this is really kind of the best 2D rendition that I could explain of what I see and feel in the body. So we really have a sixth sense that is kind of like our seeing and feeling put together. I know a lot of people know what I mean when I say that, and we call it intuition, but it's really palpable feeling and sensation. So after the experience happened, I began to sense and trace different meridians through the body. It started with meridians, and then I could feel 3 very distinct vertical lines through the body, which I didn't know at the time were Ida and Pigala and Sushumna. This went on and on until the point that essentially I began to see a weaving of Western physiology and Eastern medical systems. So geometry is really helpful because it's an agent for the human mind to be able to witness the invisible in action. So our body is frequency and our environment is frequency, and there's no difference. It's like our physical body is like this thin tissue that exists between the inner and the outer world. And the more our quantum physics talks about what they're discovering, and it's relating more to relativity, the unified field in this physics is really coming together. And it's still the holy grail. Einstein coined that term, and it was to understand how all the big things of relativity move and how all the little bits of the quantum world move and what that actual bridge is. And I call this the unified field in medicine, because there's still not a link between what we understand in Western medicine and what we understand in Eastern medicine. And so all of these different systems from the East and what we know in the West actually have a very similar bridge to the unified field theory that's getting developed in physics, particularly by Nassim Haramein. And he's discovered a very fractal way of expressing and understanding how the relativistic world and the quantum world bridge. And what I stumbled into over many years was the idea that our energy system, and it's really light frequency, which trips me out because I'm very East Coast. And so that sounded really woo-woo to me, but I realized after all these years, I was just witnessing light frequency. And now we're learning about biophoton emission and different things like that. So geometry is like a map that gives us an idea of how to actually track the nervous system and relate to the nervous system even more directly. And the link between the Western and the Eastern world is fractal in nature. Now, a fractal is a pattern that repeats itself at different scales. And I'm not going to go through all of the 24 years of putting things together. But my work that's coming out now on my website, geometrywithhealing.com, has all of that up there. So I'll let people research into that if they want to. when you're going through, when you look at the idea of geometry and frequency through the body, if you're looking at just light too, so this 2D depiction helps us see an idea, but if we're just looking at light, there's different angles to light, and this is where the idea of geometry helps. But if the angles just keep going, you just see light. And so the angles of things are actually really helpful, the geometry of things, in a very living kind of 3D way, allow us access. And I began to see planes of energy through the body that explained much more the idea of where the geometry itself was forming. So you can see the chakras down the center. In the research that I've done and in my program, I talk about how the 7 chakra system is not actually written distinctly that way in the Sanskrit texts. And there are millions of chakras in the system, and it's better described through physics and singularities. And so I go into all of that in detail. But this picture depicts the idea of where different intersection points that unite meridians and nadis and dantians and Ida Pingala Sushumna and Western physiology in different aspects. The practical application of this is that if you look at, for instance, one of the top little red dots there next to what we consider the heart chakra, that's the core energy of where something's pulling. So we think very much on the surface. We think I have, a shoulder pain, or I can feel an arm pain, or I have a pain in my neck, or a pain in my pectoral muscle, or that nagging pain at the back of your shoulders. And we're thinking that those are separate issues. But in fact, it's the core energy pulling into the center that if we're thinking about that aspect, whether we're working with ourselves through yoga or stretch or meditation, or whether as therapists we're working on other people's bodies, it gives you an immediate access to the nervous system that unlocks and releases tension. Talking quickly is my weak point. So if I'm going really quickly, just let me know. But the nervous system is a really funny thing to talk about, because my nervous system, my brain and my spinal cord and all of my peripheral nerves are talking to your nervous systems, talking about itself. So the very mirror that we live in is really trippy. And to be able to actually communicate more deeply with the very mirror of ourselves gives us deep access to the nervous system. So in short, that's what I learned. And that's my life's work. So I work as a therapist on other people. It allowed me to start actually reading by distance, which was another thing that was a little bit too weird and out of the box for me at the time. And so it took me about 7 years to really be honest that that's the work I do, and that's a large part of the work that I do. It helped me heal a lot of things that even Western medicine couldn't help me with. And I'm certainly not going to say that Western medicine is bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's vital. And I did some self-healing on myself that has really made a difference. So I believe that because of the experience, I was taken into a place where I almost died, and where I could see eventually and trace back. It was like I was walking into a forest, and I had left a trail of breadcrumbs, and at some point I lost the breadcrumbs, and I didn't even know how to get out. And then I finally kind of came back out and had a vision of what had happened. And so to me, the geometry is the breadcrumb trail into the very core inner guidance system that we look for often. Just before I tell you my story, I will just say that in 3D, because it's planes moving through the body, this is a 3D representation of planes of energy moving through the body. Now, this doesn't have to be the only geometry in the body. It's the one that I found that you can see in the 2D version. Is related to it because it's planes of energy moving through, creating intersection points and allowing us to see off and in the body. Once you have one geometry, you have all the geometries. So this is a very interesting geometry that turns out to be a double terminated crystalline structure. And it works very well when understanding how to work to core. But this is fractal, so it's not static. And that means that this shape can be infinitesimally small or extremely large and off the body. And so at what point can we see and relate to the neural frequencies of our bodies? And really, because we're fractal, we would be able to tell the health of our whole body by reading our fingertip if we knew how to do that. So the aspect of fractal medicine and fractal anatomy is something I coined many years ago. And if you Google it now, I primarily come up, but it's actually, there's a lot of medical information coming out. The hippocampus is fractal. Wilder Penfield discovered that a long time ago. The whole body can be mapped out in the brain. Or they recently discovered the hippocampus is fractal. Your heartbeat is fractal. So there's a lot to say about all that, and I'll leave that at the moment. So quickly, my story is that I was in shiatsu school, and I had taught, this is our studio in Toronto, and I was teaching something called somatic stretch that I was raised in. And I was teaching, and my whole body started feeling very, very hollow, like all of the meridians were very clear and hollow. And it felt as if I was just going to lift right out of my body. And I went home and I went to sleep, and I woke up to this very apocalyptic dream of 1,000 dead people coming out of the forest and carrying me away. And I started singing this, what I understood was a Native American chant of protection through being carried away. And when I woke up, it began a month of a lot of a very difficult time of hearing voices in my head and having auditory and visual hallucinations for no reason that I could understand. I mean, for me to just go from this to that in an instant was very surprising to me. And I'd gone to school that day, and the more and more I went through the day, because it was very subtle at that point. It was weird and almost blissful and then strange, but this manic energy started building up. And I got home that night, and I was speaking to a friend of mine, and I was sitting on a wooden table, and I was just trying to talk about my day. And it felt suddenly as if somebody had plugged the wooden table into a light socket, and the whole thing, or an electrical socket, and the whole table started vibrating underneath me. And when I jumped up, I realized it was in my tailbone, not in the table. And at that point, this sensation of 5 million volts went ripping up my spine. And it felt as if all of this darkness started coming in around the sides of my vision. And that began a month of auditory and visual hallucinations. And I was very scared. I didn't understand what had happened. The most important thing in that, and the whole month is a large blur to me in a lot of ways, but the one person I really wanted to go to was my mother. You know, when men are dying in trenches, they call out for their mother. And I think we always reach for the ultimate mother. And so I had managed to get into my car, and I had driven to her house, and I was sitting in the driveway, and I was literally banging my head against the steering wheel, trying to get the voices to stop. Because what the voices were saying was that I should kill my mother. So that was utterly bone-chillingly terrifying for me, because it was the only place I knew to go. And I was so broken at that point, I didn't even know if it was something that I was going to do. So I ran into the house, and I threw my head in her lap, and I sobbed like a child. And she just put her hands on my head and prayed to Jesus, because that's what she knows to turn to. And the reason that I'm telling you that story is because at the time when I was banging my head against the steering wheel, I was thinking, you know, this is an archetypal idea. I don't know what it means, but it doesn't mean literally kill my mother. It's something I'll understand later. I just have to know that I just can't do anything like that. But my body and brain were so broken at the time. What I understood later is that, and what I feel is really resonates truly with me, that very Kundalini Shakti energy that comes up the spine is very feminine in nature. And it's reconstructing the reality that we have been taught to believe in. That, you know, this is all that's real and nothing really out of the box happens, but we're all having out of the box experiences. And when that rush of energy comes up, and that feminine force, we'll call it for lack of a better word, comes in and really re-scrambles the psyche, we'll call the male aspect of the grounding of this reality needs to dissolve. And so there becomes a fight between the polarities, and the messages kill this energy. And because mother is the ultimate mother, the messages kill the mother. And matricide, the killing of your mother, is very common in schizophrenia. I found out afterwards. So Lee Sanella wrote a great book called Psychosis and Transcendence. And he's passed on now. He's a medical doctor. And that's a really excellent book, along with Gopi Krishna, Living with Kundalini. Those are the two pivotal books I would recommend to anybody who wants to understand both the bliss and the not so bliss sides of what can happen. And we definitely need to have a better medical and mental institution and understanding and ways of dealing with this. So at the end of a month, it was New Year's Eve, and a friend forced me to go out, which I dug my heels in and said I wouldn't do, but I eventually went out. He promised me he would pour me into a cab in 10 minutes if I couldn't stay out, but he was worried about me. And I went out, and I don't know at what point this started happening, but when I walked into the bar, I was literally glowing bright green phosphorescence. This is the part that I really don't, these two parts are the parts I don't tell anybody about. And I was so enthralled to finally not be in terror and confusion, because it was like the middle of my heart was just completely blown open, and that green that we call the heart chakra, it was like it was emanating everywhere. And 3 people came up to me that night. I mean, I thought everybody could see it. I thought it was going to be a bad movie scene. I was going to walk in, the whole bar was going to go quiet, and all of a sudden it was going to be like, what happened to you? And I would be completely ostracized. But I was too blissed out and too relieved to care. I just put one foot in front of the other. And it's New Year's Eve, and other people are drinking, and I wasn't capable of drinking. And I was just amazed to be in this environment. And 3 people came up to me that night and said, "You look so beautiful. You're just glowing." I mean, the exact same words. And I would laugh like a mad woman, because I was like, really, don't you see this? So I was watching a Joe Dispenza video just a few months ago, just in time for me to be willing to share that part of the story. And he talks about, and I'll include the link to send to you, he talks about the shift that happens in melatonin when you go through different states of alpha to delta to gamma. And then when melatonin shifts in a particular thing, a phospholuminescence, the exact same chemical constituents, that of an electric eel, happen within the psyche and within the body. And I had to literally stop the computer and just stare at the screen for a moment when I heard that. So Dispenza is doing some really interesting work around the kinds of research that we're discovering with things like that. And after that experience, I went home and I had my first good night's sleep in a month. And I woke up in a state of bliss. The green was gone, the glowing green was gone, but it had lasted for hours and hours. And I sat in my living room for 10 minutes or 10 hours, and I got this whole download of the power invested in us being so real, and that we really could do anything that we wanted to do. And this is where I could see messianic complexes can come about. And at the same time, what I could see is that we have innately so much power in us. And yet, if I were allowed to keep that level of power, I mean, I'd even seen in the night before, the kind of influence you have over people when you're emanating that much charisma, we'll call it, that much mystical, whatever it was, the ability to control other people and manipulate your environment is high. And as a species, we don't have the spiritual consciousness capable of holding on to that. I mean, look what we're already doing in the world with what we can create already, let alone if we were given more. So I understood that those curtains would close, but I was given this beautiful taste of this incredible bliss, what the Sanskrit texts call amrita, of this whole bliss through the body. That's not just a taste necessarily in the mouth, but in the taste of the entire being. And it changed my life and ended up leaving me pretty broken by the side of the road as the bliss slowly faded away. My kidneys were really shot. I was in a very dangerous physical condition. At no point did I go to the doctor. Aside to tell her, I did go once, and she told me that, you know, you can't be schizophrenic 1 month and fine the next. So I really didn't have any help in and around that. And I was, I took no antipsychotic drugs. And eventually I just created my health, getting it closer back together, and started being fascinated with the sensations that I could then feel in the body. And that's always remained with me. So my sensory awareness and ability to connect with my body and the body of others has just amplified my ability as a therapist, and has definitely helped grow me up in certain ways. So it was requested that there be some ideas at the end of things to go through. So I completely recognize that a lot of people have had really beautiful, blissful experiences. I think that's fabulous. And I had a lot of really out of the box kind of interesting things happen over the years with that. And so I certainly don't discredit the blissful activity at all. And I don't think a lot of people need a lot of coaching as to what to do, except to just enjoy it. You had asked for some points to cover in relation to people's responses. So I'm going to speak more to when people are having a difficult time. Generally, though, I think we should stop searching for it. I think the idea of being able to think that we can command or even control something as powerful as the life force energy that's in us. Oh, this is what I wanted to say. Kundalini, from a Chinese perspective, is called Jing. And Kundalini to me is when you have a radio and you've got a battery and you turn on the radio and you hear the speaker's voice and you see the little red light. You can't have the speaker's voice and the red light without the battery, but you can't divide where the battery energy is and where the speaker's voice and where the red light comes on, begins and ends. And so Jing or Kundalini, depending on whether you're speaking from a Chinese perspective or a Hindu one, is the battery pack, and the voice coming out of the radio and the red light that's on is more like chi or prana. So we have this cosmic powerful energy that our bodies could never contain, and somewhere there's this magic dropper that gives us just the drop that we need in order to be able to run our systems as we have them. And Kundalini awakening, so we all have Kundalini, we've all got the batteries running us, and we're just beginning to understand as a Western culture that thousands of years of ancient cultures were right about talking about these sorts of things. And yet sometimes the aperture, we'll say, can open and flood the nervous system with information and light, and it can scramble and overwhelm the sensory apparatus and change one's overall perspective. So the information that came in originally from me, which shook me to the bone about having absolutely no control over my own life in that way, because of the great power of that which gave me life, whatever you want to call it, that experience really ended up allowing me to see the vastness of it and the inability to actually control it. But we all have Kundalini. That's why we're here talking and breathing. So a Kundalini experience is when that aperture opens and it floods the system, and it can be very overwhelming, and it can also be blissful. And once we've kind of transformed some of the energy and the neural system has gotten used to it, then we can have more of a blissful current of running energy. But all of that information that I got then is now just part of my belief system, and it doesn't hurt, but it really hurt at the time. So searching for it, I think we just need to be a little bit more aware that we're talking about life force energy, and to think that we can command it or control it. I know there's a lot of yogis and yoginis out there who are doing a lot of things I certainly wouldn't want to say they're wrong, because I don't know, and I don't consider myself an authority. I just, I was brought to my knees, and to think that I could control that doesn't seem feasible to me. So quickly, the last two things that I want to say is, if the experience is bad, know that it's an archetypal message, and the rule of do no harm is of utmost importance. You cannot harm yourself, you cannot harm someone else. If you're getting a message, it's an archetypal message, something is moving through the system. Get the support that you need, whatever is going to be suitable for you, and you're going to know the best places to go and trust that allow you to feel safe. And ultimately, if the third point is that if you're doing grounding exercises or meditation in order to help stabilize what's going on, a lot of times it can bring the situation on even more. So if they're not working for you, don't do it. And my biggest advice is go to nature, because nature has the resonance and the grounding that allows our nervous system to connect and find a streaming that makes sense. And we live in a very disconnected world from nature, much more so than we realize. So I would say go to nature. And then there's a Jung quote at the end that I just wanted to say: there's no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And those are words that really brought very much where the darkness that I went through was really just opening into deeper spaces of light. And so we can trust the process, and we have to know that we're safe. And the fear is what made it worse. So I hope that in sharing my story, that helps eliminate some fear to anybody who might need it. And thank you very much for the opportunity to share and to hear all the other wonderful speakers.